So the government was uh, establishing themselves in British North America. The population was increasing. So laws were imposed on Indigenous peoples. So by the mid 1800s, the colonial government wanted more land for settlers. However, the government also wanted to avoid conflicts with Indigenous peoples who were already there. As well as negotiating treaties, the government began passing laws that affected Indigenous peoples, their lands, and their enfranchisement or right to vote. The government passed these laws without any input or approval from the Indigenous peoples they affected. So they didn't even consult them. They came up with these laws and said, this is how it's going to be. So who determined whether a person was or was not an Indian? Who was not involved in this determination? So this is an excerpt from an act for the better protection of the lands and property of Indians in Lower Canada in 1850. It defines who could be considered an Indian under the law. So, that the following classes of persons are and shall be considered as Indians belonging to the tribe or body of Indians interested in such lands. First, all persons of Indian blood reputed to belong to the particular body or tribe of Indians interested in such lands and their descendants. Secondly, all persons intermarried with any such Indians and residing amongst them and the descendants of all such persons. Thirdly, all persons residing among such Indians whose parents on either side were or are Indians of such body or tribe are or entitled to be considered as such. And fourthly, all persons adopted in infancy by any such Indians and residing in the village or upon the lands of such tribe or body of Indians and their descendants. So, why was the government's control over deciding who was and was not an Indian significant? How would classifying who is an Indian be beneficial to the government? How might this have impacted Indigenous peoples and individuals? So, when we're looking at that question, the government's control over who was an Indian was significant because it meant that the government had all the control. They had all the power. They chose who had access to that status and the rights that went with Indian status. It placed the power to determine and give the identity on the government rather than the Indigenous people themselves. It also gave the government considerable power over First Nations, which still has repercussions today. First Nations had no say in whether someone legally qualified as an Indian under the Indian Act. Controlling and reducing the number of people who qualified benefited the government because it reduced the cost of services and payments established in treaties. The government's power impacted Indigenous people and communities in a number of ways. People who do not qualify for status under the government's terms could not live on a reserve, which meant that families and friends could be separated. People without status did not qualify for a share of treaty payments or services, which may have caused division in the community or strained the community's shared resources. So you got to think about, well, what about the Indigenous people that have a child with a European settler? Well, are they considered Indigenous? That was a problem that the government ran into. That's a problem that the Indigenous ran into as well, as how the Métis were how treaties were come up. Oh, how did they come up with treaties for the Métis population as well, which we will talk about also.